Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining. As I've said, we're going right across the world tonight, from California on one side of the world, right to New Zealand. There were sort of like 16 countries who had asked or requested invitations for it, and I think we've probably got about 13 on. New countries this time: Greece, Germany, Sweden. So yeah, excellent. Thanks for supporting. Tonight, we're actually revisiting the session which we did in the test just over a month ago. But now that we've learnt various lessons with audio and visual, then those of you who even saw that, you'll see a different perspective this time. So Andy's going to go through the presentation, and then we'll have some option to ask questions at the end, just to make it a little bit easier for Roger and I to ask, sort of like administer the questions. In order to ask the question, if you go to if you remind me, Roger, where is it?
So reactions. Reactions at the bottom.
Or to raise the hand.
Yeah.
So if you go to the participants screen, there is an option there on the right hand side to raise hand. So if you want to ask a question, then go to that screen.
Or alternatively, Graham, you can also put a chat question, and you could
yeah,
do those as well.
Or you can type the question in there as well, and then Roger and I will look at that, and then we'll unmute you. Forgive my slightly stumbling through things. I think I've got about 4 or 5 things all going through my head at the moment. But with no further ado, I'll hand you over to Mr. Sephton.
You heard it last time. I'm afraid you're going to hear it again. It's very similar. Jokes might be slightly different, but the pictures are pretty much all the same. There's the acknowledgements. There's a whole bunch of people provided photographs for me and video. Adrenaline Media, Steve Connor down at the bottom there, provided some very good stuff. And Damien Burke, Nick Blake, Ian Frimston, Rob Lee, Steve Jefferson provided most of the photographs that are in there. This is my brief history. I've been building model airplanes pretty much continuously since 1958. I've tried all disciplines. Whatever I do, I normally come back to scale. But I've done duration stuff. I've tried control line. I didn't get on with it very well. So I went back to both free flight and radio. And I've had success at a number of national competitions, which has been rather nice. Full size wise, I got my pilot's license in 1967 at the age of 17, 2 years before I could drive a car. It's a great source of amusement to my family and girlfriend at the time. And I joined the RAF in 1969. Did 20 years in the Air Force, mainly as a fast jet pilot. On the squadron, I was electronic warfare officer. I then became a tactics instructor and qualified weapons instructor. And the highlight really of my RAF career was doing the test pilot course in France. So I always say, donc je suis pilote d'essai, which is I'm a French test pilot, not an English test pilot, but the course is similar. I left the Air Force. I did 3 tours as a test pilot in the Air Force, one at Boscombe, one at Farnborough, one in the Ministry of Defence. I then left the Air Force, joined Rolls-Royce as a test pilot and then chief test pilot, worked there for 12 years. I then moved to Marshall Aerospace in Cambridge, worked there for 9 years, retiring 10 years ago next month. Sometime after retirement, I got asked to come back to help them out. So I do the odd bit of Hercules testing now for Marshall Aerospace on a freelance basis. I had various positions of responsibility, various chief pilot slots, chief test pilot of a couple of major UK companies at times. I displayed airplanes for 21 years. became a historic aircraft pilot in 1984 when I flew Harvard at Boscombe Down, one of the photo chase airplanes. And my wife currently owns a 1944 Oster Mark V. So I've really been a historic aircraft pilot from '84 to date. I've owned my own airplane since 1990. I've been on numerous air safety boards. The major ones really being CHIRP, which is Confidential Human Factors Incident Reporting Programme for the UK, and various airshow operations, including Farnborough International and the SPAC, Society of British Aircraft Constructors Flight Operations Committee. So that's my summary for what it's worth. I'm often asked what my favourite airplanes are. I've flown about 180 different types. I've only got 8,000 hours, which in 50 odd years as a pilot is not very much, but I've been a working test pilot for the last 40 years, and test pilots don't get many hours. We get very interesting flying, but we don't fly for very long. So that's why I've got very few hours in comparison to other pilots of my age. Favourite airplanes, there's three of them. The Spitfire, obviously, one of the greatest pleasures in aviation for me was flying the Spitfire. I've flown 7 Marks from the Mark V through to the Mark 19. I'm often asked which is the best one. For me, it's the one I've just flown. The later Marks have got lots of power. The earlier Marks have got manoeuvrability. They're light and responsive, and the light responsiveness degrades as the power increases. But each has got its own place, as it were. Next one is the Blackburn 1912. Greatest privilege in aviation for me was flying that when I was at Shuttleworth, having built models of the airplane in the 60s. And started build models of it in the 60s, continued throughout the 70s and 80s, and then got to fly it in the 90s and 2000s, which was rather nice. There'll be more of that later. And the final one is the Harrier. I learned to fly that at Boscombe. I did testing on the Harrier for about 15 years. My last flight on the airplane was at NASA Ames in Moffett Field in the United States, San Francisco, where I spent 2 weeks doing software testing on a fly-by-wire Harrier that they had out there, which was rather fun. The picture that you can see on your screen is Mark V that I flew at Rolls-Royce, which had the new engine for the United States Marine Corps, Pegasus 1161, which gave up to 3,000 pounds more thrust than the engine it replaced. During the program, we needed to impinge the airplane on the press, so we decided to go for some world records. And in August 1989, I got 2 time to climb world records, and I'm just looking behind me because it's on the wall. There's 36 seconds to 3,000 meters, which is 9,000 feet, and 81 seconds to 9,000 meters, which is about 30,000 feet. Got those in August '69, and they still stand, which is rather nice. So those are the favourites. Flying historic airplane. This is my strap line, really. People often say, isn't it dangerous flying these old airplanes? No, it's not. But it is significantly different from flying modern airplanes. To put it into context, people that designed airplanes back in the early 1900s, for the most part, designed the airplane, climbed in it, tested it at the same time as they learnt to fly, and they learnt to fly the airplane. The Wright brothers did a lot of work on gliders and stuff, but essentially they just climbed in the airplanes and flew them with very little prior knowledge and certainly not much acquired skill. The fact that they survived is quite incredible. Then with minimal training, aircraft were flown during all world wars by the average teenager, particularly SE5s, Sopwith Pups, Camels in 1914-18, and in our 39-45 war. A lot of teenagers took the Spitfire to war quite successfully. So if kids can do it, then obviously adults can. They're different, they're not dangerous, and it's the differences that we're going to look at today. I'm not going to go into flying training. What I'm going to look at is examples of specific flying techniques. Just come back on that one, which will be wing warping, handling that on two applicable historic types, and rotary engines. So looking at wing warping, that was a comment by the chief pilot at Shuttleworth when I asked him what wing warping's like, and he responded, it'll never replace the aileron, which I have to say is very true. And we're going to look at the Bleriot 11. This is the world's oldest flying aeroplane. They have one at Old Rhinebeck in the States, but its construction number is slightly higher than the Shuttleworth one. So this is the oldest flying aeroplane in the world. I could go into the number of new fuselages, wings, and whatever it's had, but it's probably best that we don't, because it has crashed once or twice. Now, looking at the configuration of the aeroplane, you'll see that it's got lots of dihedral. When it sits on the ground, it sits on the ground at its flying attitude. So when it's going forward, if you look at the angle of the wing is between about 13, maybe 14 degrees angle of incidence as the aircraft is flying. And that becomes very important when you start to fly the airplane. Going to have a quick look in the cockpit. In the middle, you can see a control column. At the bottom of the control column is a device called la cloche, which is French for bell. And it's just a bell that covers bell cranks, which have wires to the pitch control and the roll control. Just in front of the cloche, you can see a rudder bar. So we've got effectively conventional flying controls. The pitch controls go to the elevators at the back. The rudder bar goes to the rudder at the back, but the roll control goes to the wing warping, which twists the wing. Wing warping is quite interesting from a mechanical point of view, because if the wing warping is easy to achieve, it means that the wings will be very prone to flutter because they can twist easily. If the wings are set up so they're nice and stiff, and obviously they won't flutter, but they then become stiff to operate, and it becomes very difficult to roll the airplane. So you need to bear that in mind as a designer and also as a pilot when you're flying them. Operating the Bleriot is very much keeping the engine running, and in order to do that, you have a manually controlled oil flow system. The oil tank is directly in front of the pilot. It's that big brass ball. It's got a valve on top to blow off pressure and a valve underneath to send the oil to the engine. To the left of it, there's an air pressure gauge, which is the only indication you have in the cockpit. And to the right of it, there's a pump where the pilot pumps the tank up to pressure. The technique is to pump the tank up to about 1.5 to 2 psi and set the lower valve at about 1/4 open. The engineers prime the engine, fire it up, and get it started. And you then adjust the oil flow so that you get a steady stream of oil back in the cockpit. If the engine starts to cough and splutter because you've over-oiled it, then you obviously reduce the pressure slightly. And if it starts to squeak and sound heavy, then you've got too little oil, so you increase it a little bit. And the skill of operating the engine is really the skill of keeping the oil flowing. Question I'm often asked is, what does the castor oil do to you? And it makes you a little bit loose for about 24 hours, but there's no real harm in that, shall we say. So that's the cockpit. Let's go back to the airplane. If we want to roll the aircraft to the left, then we put the control column to the left. That will increase the incidence on the right wing or the starboard wing and reduce the incidence on the port wing. Because of the angle of attack that the airplane has, if you increase the incidence on the right wing, you're going to increase the drag significantly. So the aircraft will yaw to the right, and because of the dihedral, it'll roll to the right. So putting the control column to the left to roll left has caused right yaw and right roll. So you get a reverse control effect. Also, if you put the control column to the left, you increase the incidence on the right wing, more often than not, that may cause the right wing to stall. So the right wing will drop. So both the primary and secondary effect of putting the control column to the left is right roll. And pilots found that out, and this is what happened. In this case, the right wing has dropped. The pilots put the control column to the left, and if you look, you can see his hand in the cockpit holding hard over on the left-hand side with the roll control, which has caused the right wing to drop. If you look at the back, you can see the rudder's hard over to the left, but it's too late. We were stuck as to what to do, as to how we should fly the airplane. And an aero modeler came up with the answer. He said, I reckon you ought to fly it like a rudder-only aeroplane and use the rudder and forget about the ailerons. So that's what we did. We flew it rudder-only, and it worked absolutely beautifully. We leave the control column in the middle. We don't bother with the roll control. We use rudder control and elevator control, and we end up with successful flights just like that. Now, the interesting thing is, if you go into the notes that people make on First World War airplanes, you'll find comments such as, if you put a lot of bank on, you can use the elevator as a rudder, which means they're using the rudder to turn the airplane when its wings level. And if they've got a bank on, they're using the elevator to turn the airplane. But in either case, they're not using the wing warping or the ailerons. If you look at the Sopwith Pup, which we will do later, and I'll show you the turn and slip indicator. In a modern airplane, you fly the airplane on the ailerons and you balance it with a rudder. If you look at the operation of this gauge, which is upside down compared to a modern airplane, you'll find that you fly the airplane on the rudder and you balance it with the wing warping. So the wing warping becomes a balance control, the rudder becomes the primary control to turn the airplane. Also, you'll find advice, never ever turn right off to takeoff because you'll crash. If you're flying a rotary, you get airborne and you turn left, you put left rudder on, which causes the nose to go up because of gyroscopic precession. If you turn right after takeoff, you put right rudder on, and the gyroscopic precession will pull the aircraft into the ground. So you never turn right after takeoff because you're flying it on the rudder and not on the ailerons. So here's a quick interlude, and we can see what a couple of successful flights of the Bleriot looks like. Hopefully this time you'll be able to hear the noise. Because the airplane is quite old and quite precious, all we ever did at Shuttleworth was hop it like that. The idea is to give the sight and sound of the airplane in the air. Right, on to the next one. You need to do a bit of reading here. I'm not going to read it out for you, but this is advice given in the pilot's notes of the airplane. So pilots were issued with notes that said what's on the screen when they came to fly the airplane. And that, of course, is the Westland Lysander. I describe it as an exceptional aeroplane. Some of it's exceptionally good, some of it's exceptionally bad. And I have to say, there's very little in between. Notwithstanding, it is a very impressive aeroplane. This is the Shuttleworth Collection airplane. It's done up in the colours of an SOE, Special Operations Executive airplane from the Second World War. Looking at the airplane, if you look at the pilot's position, you can see that his head and eyes are level with the chord line of the wing, which means you've got an exceptional field of view. It's not cockpit visibility, it's field of view. You've got an exceptional field of view all round, to the front, to the rear, above the wing and below the wing by just moving your head very, very slightly. You also might notice that the pilot sits very high, which means he can see over the nose. So unlike a number of tail draggers, you don't need to weave the airplane to see in front. You can clear it quite nicely. It's also a relatively narrow fuselage, so you can see down the side of the engine and see quite well, almost underneath the airplane to the front. So field of view is very good. It looks a bit stubby from the sides, but if we look at it from the front, it's a very clean airplane. It's got an 870 horsepower Bristol Mercury engine, which is 10 horsepower higher than the Hurricane at sea level. Hurricane's only got 860 horsepower. Hurricane reaches 1050 horsepower at full throttle height of 11,900 feet. But at sea level, it's got less power than the Lysander. As you can see, it's a very clean aeroplane. It'll fly quite nicely at 150, 160 miles an hour, burning around 30 gallons an hour of fuel. Carries 90 gallons internally and 150 gallons in the tank underneath, giving you 240 gallons. Divide that by 30 and you've got 8 hours endurance at 150 miles an hour, which is why it was so successful going to and from France to pick up and drop enemy agents. It's a nominal two-seater, one in the back, one in the front, but it's quite large in the back, so you can get up to 3 people, which was rather nice. Now, the exceptionally good and the exceptionally bad. It has fully automatic slats on the leading edge of the wing and fully automatic flaps on the trailing edge of the inner wing. The flaps and the inner slats are interconnected, so they all come out together or they all come back, blow back in together. The slats are pulled out by the center of pressure moving forward as the incidence is increased on the wing. So as you slow down and pull the stick back, incidence increases, the slats come out and the flaps go down. This means that on takeoff, as you're accelerating down the runway, if you raise the tail, you reduce the incidence on the wing, and so the flaps and the slats will blow in. So in order to make the flaps and slats stay out on takeoff, you take off with the stick fully back. So you take off in the 3-point attitude. Now, if you go to the back of the airplane, you'll see that the tailplane, on the leading edge of the tailplane, there's 3 marks. The middle mark is for takeoff, and this aircraft is taking off. The top mark is fully nose down trim, and the bottom mark is fully nose up trim. The tailplane moves up and down to trim the airplane. And to go between the two, takes about 25 pulls on a wheel on the left-hand side of the cockpit. Now at takeoff, we're in the 3-point attitude, and at this point we're doing about 70 miles an hour. And if you note the tailplane, it's at the mid position. This is the aircraft at touchdown on landing. It's doing exactly the same speed of 70 miles an hour. It's got exactly the same incidence because it's in the 3-point attitude. The slats and the flaps are out, but the tailplane has got fully nose down, which means it's in its fully up position. And if you look at the elevators, they're fully up as well. So the difference between landing and takeoff is a significantly different tailplane position. There's takeoff again, and there's landing. But the aircraft's going at exactly the same speed and exactly the same angle of attack. The only difference is in one case, you've got 870 horsepower going over the tailplane, and the other case, you haven't. And because the tailplane is energized, the downforce of a non-energized tailplane, or the amount of downforce you get from the non-energized tailplane, requires the nose to be fully down. And when the tailplane is energized by the airflow from the prop, you get the downforce you require with the tailplane in the mid position. This is why if on takeoff you raise the nose too high, when the engine quits, you've got to move the tailplane from the position shown there to the position shown there, which takes about 20 pulls on the trim wheel. And that is why it takes 600 foot to recover. The next exceptional handling quality is on landing. If you find yourself slightly high on the approach, then the natural thing to do is to put the nose down. If you put the nose down, then you'll reduce the incidence. The slats and the flaps blow in. You'll increase your speed, so you'll pull the nose back to get the speed back. The slats and flaps will come out, you'll balloon, and you'll end up 100 foot higher than you were when you started. So the way to reduce height on final approach is to pull the stick back, reduce the speed, increase the flap and slat, increase the incidence, increase the drag, and you then come down to meet the glide path. This, of course, is a no-no with any other conventional aeroplane. But the Lysander stalls at probably around 40, 50 miles an hour, and your approach speed is around 90 miles an hour. So you're way above the stall speed. So it becomes a safe operation. It took wartime pilots about 30 hours to convert to the airplane to be perfectly happy with its control characteristics. But once they were happy with it, it became a very potent aircraft in their hands. This is one of the classic different but not dangerous. This is Frank Chapman demonstrating the Shuttleworth airplane. I'm just going to come back a couple of shots. There's a couple of interesting ones. See if we can see it. We can probably see it nicely on that one there. Two mistakes that modelers make, and they all make them is when you do the exhaust ring on a Gladiator or a Blenheim or a Lysander, you make them a rusty brown. They're not rusty brown, they're stainless steel, so they're a dull metal colour, as you can see just there. And the other classic mistake that I see on so many models is that the pilot is sitting upright. If you look at the pilot in the Lysander here, and it will be even more so in the aircraft that we're going to see next, he's leaning forward. And I don't know if we can see it in these, perhaps not in those shots. Doesn't show it very well, but pilots lean forward in the cockpit, they don't lean back. And most of our model pilots are sitting upright or leaning back. There we go. Right, the next aeroplane. These are the Martlesham Heath flight reports, which give a very good description of what the aircraft is like handling wise. In fact, the first one's the ATA handling notes, the second one is Martlesham Heath. When they issued the aircraft to the front line, this is what the RAF pilot's note said, which is completely wrong. Because I tested the aeroplane and the Martlesham Heath and the ATA notes are absolutely right, but the RAF pilot's notes were wrong. And it is, of course, the Hurricane Mark 1. The Mark 2 is also unstable, but not as bad as the Hurricane Mark 1 for various reasons. Why is it unstable? It's got a Clark YH airfoil, which has got quite a high pitching moment. It's got a very small tailplane, so very little to balance the pitching moment. But more importantly, the CG is too far back, far too far back, and particularly on the naval version because of the arrestor hook that you can see in the back of this airplane. In fact, my first flight I did in the airplane, they'd got the CG wrong because they'd used a Mark II Hurricane CG schedule. The CG is defined as the distance between a datum point on the engine, and the Hurricane Mark II has got a bigger supercharger, so that datum point moved forward. So if you use the same CG on a Mark I as you do on a Mark II, it ends up 4 inches further aft. We were planning on a CG, well, we should have had a CG, I think it was 52 to 54 inches after datum, and in actual fact it was 59.5 inches after datum, which is about 100% behind where it should be, which made the handling quite interesting. If you look at the pilot there, you'll see that he's well away from the rear support at the back of his head. His body's leaning forward very slightly and his head's leaning forward quite a lot. There's another one. His head's relatively upright, but again, he's way away from the backstop. And we tend to mount our pilots in models with the head on the backstop, so they don't look right. Have I got that message across yet? If you look on the lower part of the engine cowling in between the propeller and the leading edge of the wing, you'll see a black dot. That is the hand starter for the engine. You plug in a starting handle both sides, and that is the CG datum from which the CG is measured. This is a flight at Old Warden. It is not me flying the airplane, but if you watch what happens to the pilot as it gets airborne, you'll see what we mean about instability.
Shuttleworth aircraft was built in Canada, as I said, in 1940, and carrier.
We're now going on to rotary engines, where the crank is attached to the airframe and the engine rotates around it. It came from a French idea where they used to power bicycles, and the engine became the bicycle spokes with the wheel attached around the outside of the engine. They were then developed and became quite an ideal power plant for the early aircraft of the First World War. And what I'm going to do initially is look at the Sopwith Pup. For me, it was a great privilege to fly the airplane. I built models of it as a kid, never thought I'd fly the thing. But back in 1976, I was on my first squadron in the Royal Air Force, 54 Squadron, and we had our 60th anniversary. The squadron had formed in 1916 in France on the Sopwith Pup. And as luck would have it, we had the original boss, Major K.K. Horn, and his adjutant, Captain Charlie, who'd formed the squadron in 1916 as guests of honour at the 60th anniversary in 1976. A lot of other people as well, a lot of Second World War pilots. Bill Hooper, who was the creator of Pilot Officer Prune, was there. Can't remember his name, but the chap that flew the Hunter underneath Tower Bridge, he was at the same party. So lots and lots of quite famous people. But Captain Charlie gave the speech at the dinner that we had on the Saturday evening. He said he gave 3 anecdotes of the First World War, and I can only remember one of them, so I'll give it you now. This is a quote from Captain Charlie, and he said, "In retrospect, it was a rather silly thing to do. But in my defence, it was after a particularly drunken night in the mess, and I did win the bet. And I do believe I am the only person ever to fly a Sopwith Pup stark naked over the Western Front." The following day, I showed a lot of ground crew around the hangars. We'd got Jaggers at the time. And one of the First World War ground crew chaps looked up at me and he said, "Hey, young man," he said, "how often do you crash your machines?" And I said, "Well, we don't crash them at all, really." And he said, "Really? We used to crash ours every day," which again gives you a philosophy of what it used to be like in the First World War. Right, off we go. This is the front end of the Sopwith Pup. I'm not sure. No, we haven't. This is the front end of the Sopwith Pup. If you look on the right, you'll see a label crankcase. Just under that, fuel air distribution tube should be marked. If you come backwards, i.e. to the left, you'll see an arrow pointing to a tube on the side of the airframe. That's the air inlet. And if you look at the top left of the diagram, you'll see an arrow pointing at the carburettor. The air goes in the air inlet. It's mixed with fuel at the carburettor. It goes along a hollow crankshaft, and it's distributed in the crankcase through the distribution tubes to the cylinder heads, where it's burnt in the engine. So very simple. This is a wiring diagram of the, as it were, of the engine fuel system. At the top, we have a pump, propeller pump, and a hand pump that produce pressure. There's a pressure relief valve that blows off at about 2¼ psi. There's a main tank that's pressurized. Air pressure gauge in the cockpit showing how much pressure we have so that we can adjust it if it's too big or too small. The fuel comes out of the tank, goes through a fuel cock, and then it goes to a needle valve or Tampier filter tap, as it says on the diagram, or fuel valve. And you'll find that particular valve referred to as all three of those: needle valve, Tampier filter tap, or fuel valve. It continues on. It then goes to the carburetor, where there is a block tube control or a fuel air control. Again, it's the same lever, but it's called two different things. It basically controls the fuel air mixture that's going into the engine, or it controls the amount of fuel air that's going into the engine. The fuel air mixture is controlled by the fuel valve, the needle valve, Tampier filter tap. That's the amount of fuel that goes to the engine. The amount of fuel air mixture that goes in is controlled with the block tube or the fuel air lever. So going one step further, while we're on the subject, if you go back to the top, the Rotary propeller pump, we had a little bit of a problem replacing some of those. So we got a quite famous model airplane engine manufacturer to make us some Rotary propeller pumps and also to carve us some props. So most of the World War I airplanes in the Shuttleworth Collection have model engine technology, which is rather nice. This is the cockpit. On the right-hand side, you'll see a pump marked number 1. That's the hand pump to pump up the tank if you need it. Going to the left, you've got a number 2, which is an altimeter. Underneath it, number 3, the airspeed indicator. To the left of that, number 4 is the ignition switches. To the left of that, number 5 is the control column. And if you go to the top of the control column, you'll see number 6, which is a button called the blip switch. That cuts the ignition to cut the engine, should you require it. On the floor, we've got number 7, which is the rudder bar, which is a conventional control. Going to the top, we've got number 8, which is a compass. Just below it, number 9, is the level indicator, which is equivalent to the modern turn and slip. And this is the indicator that if you use it in its natural sense to balance the aircraft, if you try using the rudders, you'll move the rudders in the wrong sense. But if you try and balance the aircraft with the control column using the ailerons, then you will balance it, which comes back to the fly the airplane on the rudder, turn it on the rudder, and use the ailerons to balance. Number 10, high left, is the RPM. Just below it, number 11, is the oil pulsator. As the engine rotates, the oil pressure to the engine changes, and there's a meniscus, the level at the top of within that bell moves up and down, which tells you that there's oil going to the engine. Below that is the fuel cock, number 12. To the left of that and high is the air pressure gauge, number 13. And then we come back to the throttle quadrant, levers number 14 and 15, and the quadrant itself. I think the next picture, yes, that's better. Next picture shows the engine control levers. Throttle quadrant in a modern airplane, engine control levers in a Rotary. They go on a device which is marked 0 to 10. And if you look on the inside of the lever 14, the tall lever, the block tube lever, the fuel air lever, all the same thing, number 14, you'll see a marker, and that indicates the position of that lever against the scale that's on the quadrant. Come to the left of that, 15 is the petrol lever or the Tampier filter tap or the fuel lever. And again, that's got a marker on the inside so that you can mark its position against the quadrant. Let's go on to the next one. This is the block tube carburetor that sits behind the engine, in line with the engine and in line with the pipes on the side of the airplane. If you look to the left of the picture, you've got an air in. That's the tubes either side of the airplane that let the air in. Just above that, you've got fuel in. That's the fuel that comes from the fuel lever. Over to the right, you've got cockpit control. That is the block tube lever, the tall lever that controls a slider that slides across the opening that goes to the engine, which is the opening at the front. And inside that, you've got a needle valve that controls the fuel that's coming out of the fuel in pipe. So when you move the cockpit control, you've got a slider that goes across and blocks off the flow of air to and from the engine. It's not a butterfly, so there's no suction. So you have to rely on pressure to get the fuel in there. But it also means you get no icing, which is an advantage. And the needle valve, when it's fully closed, no fuel will go through because the needle valve won't let it. When it's fully open, you get full air control, and the amount of fuel that you've defined with the fuel lever coming in from the left-hand side. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is a view from above. We've got the cross pipes at the top. You've got the sliding block tube in the middle, and at the bottom, the fuel air mix going to the engine. If we look at the relationship between the petrol lever and the block tube lever, we end up with a graph as presented here. The petrol lever is on the left-hand side, and I've marked 20% and 40%. That is roughly 20 to 40% of movement on that quadrant. On the bottom scale, you've got 30 to 70% for the block tube or fuel air lever. And if you look at the lines in the middle, the only time the engine will run smoothly is when it's inside those two lines, the two white lines, top and bottom. If we run the engine above those lines, you end up with it rough running with a rich cut because you put too much fuel in. And if you run it below those lines, you've got a lean cut because you're not putting enough fuel in, because you have to match the fuel flow with the block tube lever. So looking at the levers, A is where we start, which is top left. We have the block tube lever set at a low power setting, and we have, which is number 14, we've got the petrol lever set off. The ground crew will prime the engine and spin it up by hand to distribute the fuel. They'll tell the pilot they're ready. The pilot puts the ignition switch on, and the ground crew then turns the propeller, and the engine should fire and burn off the prime. As the prime is burned off, we move the petrol lever up very slowly to get to position B, where the petrol lever is about 20–30%, block tube lever is about 30–35%. That will run the engine at around 800–900 RPM, which is too much to taxi, probably enough for level flight, but not full power. We let the engine warm up at that level. We then want to increase the power to check full power. So we move, going down to diagram C, bottom left, we move the block tube forward. Because we haven't got enough fuel going in, the engine will probably quit. We then move the fuel lever forward to match the block tube, and the engine comes back online again because we had a lean cut. Once we've found the position of the levers for the high power, we then want to go to low power again. So position D, we move the fuel lever to off, and I'll explain why in a minute. The engine then, although it's rotating, it stops firing. We then bring the block tube back to position A, top left, and we then, before the engine stops rotating, move the fuel lever forward to position B to get back to the 30% position again to get an idle. We can then wave the chocks away. Once the chocks are out of the way, the aircraft starts to move forward, and we can then go back to the high power setting. So looking at all that on the diagram, this is the engine running at around 800 RPM. That's the big yellow spot. I've got the fuel air lever at about 30% and the fine adjustment at around 25%, something like that. And the engine is running quite nicely at 800 RPM. If I increase the petrol lever, move it forward, without moving the block tube, I'll end up with a rough running and a rich cut because I'm putting too much fuel in. So in order to accelerate the engine, I move the block tube forward so we get the horizontal black line. And because I've not got enough fuel going in for the power that I've set, the engine will stop firing. I then increase the petrol lever to get back into smooth running range, and the engine will start to run smoothly. Similarly, when I reduce the power, if I pull the block tube back, then because I've got the petrol lever set for high power, if I pull the block tube straight back, then I'll end up with too much fuel going in the engine for the block tube position, and I'll end up with a rich cut. Now, a rich cut takes about 30 seconds to clear, so it won't clear on the ground. Got too much fuel in, you've got to clear a whole crankcase full of rich mixture, and in the air it will take probably 1,000 foot. On the ground, you've just got to start again. Whereas a lean cut will come back online almost immediately when you start putting the fuel in. So a lean cut is a lot better than a rich cut. So in order to decelerate the engine, we lower the fuel lever, so the engine stops firing but still rotating. We then move the block tube back. We then increase the fuel lever. By doing all of that, we note the settings for high power, we note the settings for low power when we're doing our engine ground run. We then know where we set the power levers when we do our takeoff. We're now going to go on to the Blackburn. So we now know where the power levers are set for takeoff. Two further issues. As we accelerate down the runway, the propeller unloads, the engine starts to rotate faster. Because it's a rotary, centrifugal force flies the mixture out, which enriches the mixture. So if you don't lean off very slightly during the takeoff run, you'll get a rich cut. The engine will quit shortly after takeoff. Similarly, as you are slowing down in flight, then you have to enrich in the mixture to stop it from stopping. As you climb, then you have to lean the mixture, otherwise it will get too rich as the air gets thinner as you get higher. And again, as you descend, you have to enrich in the mixture. So you're constantly moving the levers throughout the flight, listening to and feeling the engine, and having it run within the middle of the sweet spot. A heavy exhaust note indicates rich, a light exhaust note indicates lean, and it's better to have it lean rather than rich. You can get about 800 to 1,000 RPM. 800 is too much to descend. So in order to descend the aeroplane, then you cut the fuel off. There is a blip switch, which will allow you to stop electricity, stop the spark from going to the spark plugs, so that you can cut the power by blipping. But if you use blipping in the air, then every time you blip, you shock load the engine. So you try not to blip at high power. Also, if you blip the engine to descend, there's fuel still going into the engine. So when you release the blip switch to turn the electricity back on again, there's a very high chance that you're going to get a fire. So the way to descend the aeroplane is to turn the fuel off. And so every landing in a rotary engine airplane is a forced landing, i.e. engine off. You get the airplane in the position where you could land it, you turn the engine off, and then you fly around finals, adjusting the flight path to land back on the airfield. It's not as difficult as it sounds, excuse me, because the aircraft will stop in about 50 yards. Old Warden is at least 60 yards, 600 yards on the runway. So if you aim for the middle of the airfield, which you'll hit every time, then it's not an issue. In the latter stages of the approach, in order to give power should you require it to stop a swing, then you feed the fuel back in to get the engine back online, and then use the blip switch to kill it. You can do it at that point because the engine's not running very fast, and it's only for a very short time. Once the engine's on the ground, you can then release the blip switch to get power to control the aircraft, but then you bring the aircraft down to as lower RPM as you can, and as soon as you can, stop the engine once it's temperature stabilized, because again, ground running, there's a fair chance you'll overheat it. So the Blackburn, this is the control system. It's got the Blackburn patented control wheel, marked as number 1 on the drawing. You rotate it for roll control. You lift it up and down for pitch control, and originally you moved it left and right for yaw control. That was far too complex and didn't really work in practice, so they put rudders on this aeroplane. You lift it and lower it for pitch, and you rotate it left and right for roll. Number 2 is the blip switch. Very easy to find when you're static on the ground, but when you're flying, of course, you're putting roll control in on the airplane, so that button can be anywhere, and trying to find it when you really need it can be a little bit of a trick. If you go to the right-hand side of the cockpit, you'll see 3 levers, marked 3, 4, and 5. It hasn't got a block tube, it's just got a hole in the engine inlet tube where fuel goes in. It's also got a butterfly valve, which controls the amount of air that's going in. Again, it's not on a suction system. You don't get a Venturi, but there is a butterfly valve, and there's a Bunsen burner type valve at the intake. So the Bunsen burner valve we open fully and leave it fully, and then we operate the engine as a normal rotary using the other 2 levers. The butterfly valve controlling the amount of power, and the fuel lever controlling the amount of fuel that goes in. And it becomes very similar to the Sopwith Pup. Number 7 on the cockpit, right-hand side, are the 2 oil pulsator gauges. One is pre-oil pump, the other's post-oil pump, to let you know there's oil going in. And number 6, right in the middle, is the RPM gauge, the only instrument in the airplane. RPM is important. You need at least 1,000 RPM to go flying. If you can't get 1,000 RPM by adjusting the levers, then you don't fly. But if you can get over 1,000 RPM or over, you've got enough power to fly, and away you go. So that is a very important gauge. The next, I think, yes it is. I'm just going to hold that a sec. This is a flight in the airplane. There's a Ferguson tractor going in the background, so you don't hear it. You can't hear the aircraft as well as you could, as you should. The ground crew will squirt fuel in each cylinder in turn. They depress the exhaust valve, pop a little bit of fuel in. They then spin up the propeller to distribute the fuel, get the pilot to set the throttles, and then turn the ignition on, and then they spin up the engine. If you watch the exhaust, one thing that fascinates me when I see it is on a rotary, the exhaust comes out at the same point on the engine. The cylinders are moving. It obviously comes out each cylinder in turn, but because the cylinders are moving and because of the way the timing is set, the exhaust valves open at exactly the same position of the engine. So the exhaust comes out at the same place, same point in rotation each time. And I think that's it. There we go, a flight in the Blackburn.
Yeah. So, it's a bit more control than the other two. It's a fine looking aeroplane. This aerodynamic unit. Yeah, it's just anybody that can come up with that result to the indicator and say, yeah, that's the way to do it. You're going to rush out and play. Hopefully, yeah, it's going to be over there.
So that's it. And here's the summary. It's not difficult, but it's certainly different. Are there any questions? Right, I've stopped the share.
There we go. So Borja Sebring from Sweden. Did you have a question? I see that you've got the hand raised, or was that just when you were checking it earlier? Roger, it's BSEBR.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute him now, but I think he's muted himself. B.
Everybody's microphones.
I'll do that. I'm mute all. Right, he should be on now.
There we
Everybody.
go. Borja Sebring, there you go. You can ask your question.
There's still a lot of microphones that are.
Yeah, I've done an unmute all. The people might have muted themselves, so.
Oh, okay, cool. Right.
I don't think his audio is working.
No, but is the microphone working?
Yeah, we've got you now, yeah.
That's us now.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question about the Sopwith camel, who is told about, and that's about the Euro effect when he fly the Sopwith, and I wonder how much the Euro is when he turn around the airplane. How much the Euro is make it difficult to fly the airplane.
It's not difficult, but it's different. So that's all I can say. I've not flown the Sopwith Camel. I've flown probably the Sopwith triplane is the nearest, because that's got a quite high-powered Clerget engine in. You just have to be very careful. What I noticed on the rotaries was that there's probably the same amount of gyroscopic rigidity and precession on a high-powered rotary as there is on a Griffon engine Spitfire. So you get a similar amount of adverse yaw and a similar amount of precession when you use the rudder or when you use the pitch. When you're trying to rotate and pitch, it'll go sideways. When you're trying to use the rudder, then it'll act in pitch. But it's not difficult. It's a characteristic of the airplane that you have to get used to. So I can't tell you what it's like on a Camel because I've never flown one. But you just need to be cognizant of it. On the Pup and the triplane, if you are doing a low level turn at high bank and hard pull, then you've got to be very careful to balance any precession with the rudder. Otherwise, you could find yourself flying into the ground. But that's the same on any aircraft with a big propeller on it or a heavy rotating engine.
There we go. Cliff Harvey. You're off mute, so if you want to ask your question.
Yes, I was just asking about the Lysander actually, with the trim settings on the tailplane. Does that apply to a model as well?
If you want to make it accurate, then yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, you don't need to fiddle with the angle of incidence.
Oh, I see. No, what you would probably have the CG further back on the model. The Lysander has got the CG way forward to what it really needs to be, which is why you need a lot of tailplane change with power and also with speed. But that makes it very stable in pitch. So when you're going a long way, you're flying down to the middle of France from UK and back again, you can trim the aircraft out and then take your hands off and it will fly itself.
Right.
So if you had a similar CG position, then yes. But with the model, I suspect the CG is further back and therefore you don't need it.
Yeah, sure. Because I know you're building a free flight rubber, was it? The one you had in the magazine this month?
It's a rubber one, but I'm converting it to electric for indoor electric RC.
Yeah.
Indoor electric RC scale. Correction, indoor electric RC kit scale. Because it's an awful kit, isn't it? Where's Martin Kinder? He built the 36-inch version. He's around here somewhere. I built the 36-inch version a few years ago, which is why I'm doing the 48-inch one.
Right.
Martin's recently built the 36-inch, and I think he's probably got the same same comments as I have. Awful kit. It's not in any way and easily built.
Mine flew quite nicely until you tried to slow it down, and at which point it dropped out of the sky.
Yeah.
It was a handful. It flew beautifully at a nice cruising speed. But bloody awful if you tried to land it.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see if the same thing happens on the 48-inch version.
Yeah.
Richard Krapp.
Yeah. Andy mentioned that some model manufacturer made the Rotherham pumps, the modern ones.
Yeah.
Just wondered who it was.
Give me the name of some engine manufacturers.
Bill Tidy.
It's not Bill Tidy. It's not a. It's somebody who modifies and repairs engines as opposed to manufactures them from.
No.
No.
Highlander.
No.
I can't remember his Christian name.
Yeah, it's on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't think of it. But it is relatively local to Bedfordshire.
Western.
That sounds familiar. It could be. Leave that one with me. I'll find out and I'll let you know. There we go. That's probably the best way so that we don't guess. You've got a visitor, Mike Barbie. Is she scared of dogs? No, I won't bring mine in here then.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it, John.
Well, I was very curious about the handling characteristics of the Hurricane, because I'm reliably informed by a late parent now that the Hurricane was very much liked by its pilots who were reluctant to move to Spitfires, which kind of contradicts what you're saying about its handling.
It surprised me too. I heard the Hurricane was a good gun platform, very easy to fly, very robust, and liked by the pilots. When I first flew it, it was all over the sky because the CG was further back than it should have been. When we got the CG right, it's still unstable. You can't let go of the stick. You've got to fly it all the time. You can't trim it out. If you get any minor perturbation in pitch, it's off in any direction. It feels like it. I went to a dinner with Bill Pegg, the Brabazon test pilot, about 20 years ago now, and asked him his opinion. He looked down his nose at me and he said, everybody knows that the Spitfire gets its aerodynamics, its maneuverability from aerodynamics, and the Hurricane gets it from instability. So it was designed like that, to be unstable so that it could be maneuverable. A lot of aircraft had pretty rough handling qualities in those days, so it wasn't any different to what they were used to. And because of its instability, it's highly maneuverable in pitch. So once you've got used to it, then you don't notice it, and it then becomes a delightful airplane to fly.
Yeah.
So it's not as bad as I made out, really. I don't like it very much. I much prefer the Spitfire. But it comes down, I think, to horses for courses. It was obviously a very effective airplane, but it was unstable in pitch.
Now, it's not an aircraft that you mentioned during your presentation there, but Roger, if you can unmute Greg Lett, then I'm sure he probably has a question about an aircraft he's got a great fascination with at the moment.
Yeah, he's going to ask me about an email that I didn't reply to yet.
Oh,
you, Greg?
Sorry.
Where is it? Greg Lett?
Lett.
Yeah, that's all right. I've unmuted myself.
Okay, well done.
There we go.
Sorry, Greg. I owe you an apology, mate. I should have sent you an email yesterday, but
oh, that's all right. No, I
completely
forgot.
I
was just a bit concerned that you didn't get it. The first one was quite a large file, so
yeah.
But it was more the other question I asked.
I got the email, got both of them, so thanks very much. I will respond.
That's all right. That's
I've
all
not
right.
forgotten. I just haven't got round to it yet. Right.
Yeah, that's all right. That's fine. So Graham put me on the spot a bit, but I think flying the Bristol M1C, I think with discussions with yourself and some of the notes you've given me, I think I've got a fairly good understanding of how the real one flies as to how my model flies. And one of the things I've been really trying to do is look at some of the videos of the M1C and try and replicate that in the model, which has been a really interesting exercise, actually. I found that a lot of what I do and the way I fly it is mainly on rudder, and then trying to keep the wings in the right attitude as the secondary. So what sort of comments have you got about that?
On the full size, the aileron control is awful. It's 30 degrees of bank one way. If you put full aileron on, it takes about 5 or 6 seconds to roll to 30 degrees of bank the other way, which for a fighter is unacceptable. So it must have been flown. I think it's because when you put full aileron on, the wing twists in the opposite direction. Doesn't matter how tight that you rig it, it's going to twist in the opposite direction and negate the effect of the aileron. So it must have been flown on the rudder to get the adequate roll control for a fighter.
Yeah, so what I found that it flies a lot nicer on rudder than it does on ailerons, and it's interesting what you say about the rigging, because I've re-rigged it to make it a lot more solid, and it did help. Certainly helped with the roll.
Yeah, it happened. A lot of full-size replicas of wing warpers, they put ailerons on them to make the roll control better. But all they do is make it worse, because when they move the ailerons, the wing twists in the opposite direction, and you get no effect at all. At least with the wing warping, you do get some roll sometimes. But there you go.
Yeah, thanks, Andy.
You're welcome, Greg.
There's a question from Phil Kingsbury saying, "Hi Andy, which of the Shuttleworth aircraft did you enjoy flying the most and why?"
The Blackburn, because of my emotional attachment to it. And it's also the easiest Shuttleworth airplane to fly. And it's the only Shuttleworth airplane that is stable around all three axes. Whereas all the others are unstable around at least one, and some of them around all three. Box kite is unstable in pitch, unstable in yaw, and neutrally stable in roll. Yeah.
There we go. And then Bert Van Eyck, you should be off mute so you can ask your question, Bert. Well, you're off mute, but we can't hear you.
Where is he?
Galaxy Tab S2.
Got it. I can see your lips moving, Bert.
Yeah. Yeah, your volume's down or your mic's off.
Is better?
That's better.
We've got you.
I try to tell that I have not any question, but I move my hand only.
Ah, okay.
Are you speaking from the Netherlands?
I'm speaking from the Netherlands.
I had the privilege of flying one of your airplanes. I did the first flight on the C130 Hercules on the cockpit upgrade back in 2008, which was a great privilege for me. There you go. And we come over to Netherlands twice a year to do the simulator at Eindhoven, which is rather nice. Eindhoven, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
With the Royal Netherlands Air Force.
My son is flying in Gilserijen.
Yeah?
The Chinook pilot.
Oh, okay. It's got the propellers on the wrong side of the fuselage.
Yeah,
right?
There are big ones, eh?
Yeah, yeah. And we've got 4 propellers on ours as well.
Okay.
Bit more redundancy.
When you come to Holland, give a message and we can invite you.
Oh, okay. That'd be nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, Graham. That was a bit of personal stuff there.
Not at all. David Oakley.
Yeah, might be easy for me just to read it out. Andy, thanks for the talk. Really enjoyed it. Second time round as well as first. So thank you very much for doing that. The juggling the fuel lever and the fuel air lever in the pup. How easy is it to get used to having those levers in the right position, especially like if you're in a sort of dogfight, when you're trying to concentrate on not being shot down and trying to keep your engine running as well. How much of a nightmare is that, and how much cerebral power does it take to do both at the same time?
In the limit, very little. For a modern pilot, you don't dogfight, so it's not an issue. And the way we taught people at the Shuttleworth was to give them a very good briefing, a couple of ground runs, and then get them to get airborne and fly in the overhead of the airfield. So the issue with the Rotary is if you really screw up the engine handling, then your engine stops and you can't get it started again. So you fly the airplane in such a way that you can force land it on the airfield. at any time during the flight. And then you get the pilots to play with the engine controls, do a rich cut, do a lean cut, and see what they're like, see what they sound like. And it only takes 2 or 3 flights to be competent enough to display the airplane. As you've done a little bit more, 4 or 5 flights, then it becomes a natural thing, and you can listen to the engine while you're flying it, but you can also feel the engine through the airframe. You've got the block tube in your fingers. In fact, if I can hold my hand up, you've got the block tube in the fingers there, and the thumb operates the fuel control. So you can do the big lever like that and the small lever like that and operate the two together. And after 3 or 4 flights, it becomes a natural thing. Back in the First World War, they got the pilots to run rotary engines on the ground. They got ground test rigs. And they just ran them and ran them and ran them until they knew how to do it standing on their heads. So by the time they came to fly the airplane, they'd all
second nature.
They'd got an absolute feel for it. You've got a certain amount of power, brain power, when you fly an airplane. Modern pilots, the flying of the airplane is an absolute piece of ease, but the operating of the weapon system takes 99% of your brain power. With the older airplanes, the weapon system's dead easy, and the instruments are dead easy. So you've got 99% of your brain available for flying the airplane and operating the engine, which nowadays a computer does it for you. In those days, you were the computer that ran it. But no big issue. It sounds complex. It comes down to it's different, but it's not dangerous. And all you need is a good briefing and a good bit of teaching, and then it's quite straightforward.
Yeah, it sounded, when you were explaining, it sounded very complicated, especially in the panic situation when some bugger's shooting at you.
Yeah, it does sound complex, but what I try to get across is what you can do and what you can't do. Might change the way I do it, but there you go. It is what it is. Just a matter of interest, did the video come through all right this time? The noise.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Because last time, when you share screen, there's 2 settings: one to optimize the video and one to optimize the sound. So if you end up doing one of the lectures, when you do share screen, click on both of the 2 buttons: the button that shares the video and the button that shares the sound, which was the secret. My wife came up with that one because she read the instructions. Right, next one. How are we doing? Are we okay for time, by the way?
Yep, all good. Anyone?
It's wine o'clock here, by the way.
Just, Andy, you mentioned about the fact that certainly the World War I airplanes that you'd flown suffered from very poor aileron control, because whenever you put on aileron deflection, the wing itself is so flexible that it neutralizes most of it. Would that not be true to say that that would follow for most aeroplanes of that era?
Yeah, it does. The LVG C6 was the worst because the rear spar was in the middle of the wing.
Yeah.
So the LVG C6 had got absolutely no aileron control at all. And because it was a flat wing, you got very little from the rudder. So if you drop to wing, you put the aileron over and nothing happens. You put full rudder and nothing happens. So you have to pull the stick back a bit to get a bit of instance to increase the roll control due to dihedral. And then it rolls back, and then you relax, and then it goes off the other way.
I noticed it's sort of flying life at Old Warden wasn't very long.
That wasn't the reason, but it wasn't a very pleasant airplane to fly. In fact, the World War I pilots of the day, the SE5, in fact, the LVG pilots weren't allowed to turn below 500 feet because of the lack of roll control.
Right.
And the SE5 pilots would write reams and reams about fighting Fokker triplanes, and then put, oh, by the way, shot down 2 LVGs on the way home because they were kind of easy meat.
No, I just wondered whether it was. I mean, obviously, as construction techniques improved, it might account for why certain World War One designs, in actual fact, as an RC model, can actually be real pigs. But then I suppose a lot of the designs of the wing is in a model is probably considerably stiffer than the full size would have been.
Mm. Yeah, I think in models we like the models to be a lot more manoeuvrable than the full size airplanes.
Well, yeah.
And if you've got a model that took 5 seconds to go from 30 degrees of bank one way to 30 degrees of bank the other with full roll control, then what would you say? You know, it's a long time.
Yeah, I'm thinking
that's the maximum roll rate that you could achieve, and that's the roll rate of the Bristol M1C on aileron alone.
Yeah.
So our models will roll a lot quicker than that, but we still think it's sluggish.
Oh yeah. Well, too rapid a roll rate is a common problem with most scale models.
Yeah, I agree.
Particularly well, as you know, we judge together, particularly with World War II airplanes.
Mm.
Well,
I blame it on the modelers, to be honest, but there you go.
I'll ask a quick question about the engine in the Blackburn. Is that the original engine that was with the airframe when it was built?
I think so, but I'm not sure.
How many hours would that have done? Have you no idea?
Probably about 20, full, all told. It doesn't fly very often. We only fly it for about 5 minutes a time, probably 3 or 4 times a year.
Right, okay.
Sometimes not at all.
Yeah, I've only seen it twice in 15 years. Yeah. Interesting.
Any other questions from anyone?
Yeah, a quick one, if I may.
Yep.
Andy, you spent a lot of time on fighters, but the SE5A, have you tried that one?
Yeah, I've flown the SE5A. That is a lovely airplane. It's got lots of power, lots of control. There's 2 issues with it. One of them is it's got the most horrendous adverse yaw because the ailerons deflect equidistant up and down. So you need an awful lot of rudder to stop the aircraft yawing when you roll it. And you can get into a bucketing position if you don't land it absolutely 3 points because of the spring in the tail skid and the main wheels. You can end up bucketing down the whole length of the runway. But apart from that, lovely airplane to fly. I read in, I think it was High Flight, one of the guys that flew the aircraft during the war was quite scathing of it because he said anybody who could design an airplane that has 2 different guns on it has obviously never been to war or even considered war. He said, and anybody who has mounted a gun with a rotary magazine on top of the wing, he said, have you ever tried pushing that back up or even pulling it down in 120 knot gale, which is what you got when you're flying the airplane at high speed, and trying to put a magazine onto a gun in 120 knot wind with the magazine flat plate onto the wind. He said it's a complete and total waste of time. He said just used to shoot the Vickers gun and ignore the Lewis. So that's a pilot's point of view. And I never thought of it like that, to be honest. Practicalities of having a Lewis gun on top of the wing. Would have been far better to get a better concentration of bullets by having 2 Vickers side by side.
Yeah.
I take the silence to mean that there's no more questions.
I've got a hand up.
Oh,
Doug, there he is. Hello, Doug.
Hello, Andy. I understand exactly what you're saying about that Lewis gun on the top of the SE5, but I have read an account somewhere in what's First World War aviation series?
Crossing Cockade.
Yeah, that's exactly the one. I've got an article somewhere that says that concept was introduced by Albert Ball. Now, I don't know whether that's absolutely correct, but that's what I'd read. But I can see your point. It's a bit of a nonsense having to stand up and play around with a drum to stick it on the top of the Lewis gun. Yeah.
Well, you pull the gun down to get it vertical. Yeah. You said then you're trying to put this flat plate circular thing about a foot across.
Straight in front of your face, yeah.
In 100-odd knot gale. And while you're still, with the stick between your knees, trying to fly the aeroplane while somebody's shooting at you.
Yeah, Doug, I've read something very similar, that it was Albert Ball who did that, and he was just concerned because I think prior to that, all the aeroplanes he'd flown only had one Vickers, and he just wanted to increase the firepower. He wanted to increase the weight of fire because he realised that it was weight of fire that was going to do the business. And the only way that the RAF thinkers at the time was to strap what in effect is an infantry weapon, and the only place they could do it quickly was on the top wing. But of course, the Lewis never was equipped with belt feed.
No,
so
it was
there was no option but to use the rotary mag on the top, and that was where it was. And if you think about it, when the gun's on the ground, it's very easy to change the magazine, but as Andy's quite pointed out, that when you're in a 100-mile-an-hour plus gale, it's not quite so simple.
No, wasn't there something as well about trying to reach the height of some of the balloons as well? To have a gun on the top wing was advantageous.
Well, that was it, so that you could fire upwards.
Yeah.
The only thing in the Lewis's favour, according to what I've read, is that it was a much lighter weapon.
Yeah.
Which is why most two-seaters had them in the rear cockpit rather than the Vickers.
Yeah, it's all interesting.
Stick of Vickers on the scarf ring in the rear cockpit made such a mess of the SG of the aeroplane that it was just too much to deal with. And you could put two Lewises in the place of one Vickers if you wanted to.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you look at, they kept on with it because, I mean, if you look at some of the World War II airplanes, they often had a Lewis gun in the back.
Yeah.
Must have. You weren't out in the slipstream, so it was probably a bit easier to change magazines. But I mean, you can draw a parallel with when they first put 20mm cannons in the Beaufighter. And I was reading.
Before you carry on, I'm going to have to take about 30 seconds, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So if there's any more questions, I'll be back in a bit. But I've got a minor personal hydraulic problem.
I was just going to say,
too much wine.
Reading Townsend's Night Fighter book about flying the early Beaufighter with the cannons that didn't have belt feed, had rotary magazine. A magazine full of 20mm cannon shells weighs about 10 times as much as a Lewis magazine, and he's got a very vivid description of trying to change the magazine when the pilot up front is putting the stick in all four corners, and he's trying to change the magazine in flight. And he actually injured himself quite severely more than once because he lost control of the magazine. It took over. And his fingers were bashed and broken and got in an awful state. Plus the fact that it's in semi-darkness.
Yeah.
The amount of light available, and of course they were flying at night anyway, so it would have been a nightmare trying to change the magazine on a 20mm cannon. Crikey.
Yeah.
there's a lot of interesting stuff on that subject. If anybody's interested, I've got a book all about all about air weapons, and it's useful if you can get hold of a copy of it.
Mr. Jackson, you've joined us with your video now.
I found out how to do it.
Yay! It's taken an hour and a half, but we've got there.
That's okay, yeah.
I don't know if you can see that.
Back with you.
Putnam's.
Okay.
You can get hold of a copy of that. There's a lot of good stuff in there about how they evolved with the Lewis gun and the. So you can pick them up from the second-hand bookshops quite reasonably.
Okay, so just I think we can all sort of we could end up speaking all night. So is there any more questions? Yeah.
Graham, one question for Andy. Yeah. Has he flown the Bristol Fighter?
Yes, I have, Ricky. It's a lovely aeroplane, very easy to fly.
Okay, because my flight instructor at Cranfield was a chap called Bert Russell, and he at that time was displaying the Bristol Fighter, and he sort of commented on it was a nice aeroplane to fly. Did it presumably had enough power?
Yeah, lots of power. I can't remember the horsepower. I think it's something around 150.
No, 275 on an Eagle.
275 on an Eagle.
Yeah. I think it was the Eagle, wasn't it? Not a Falcon? Oh, one of the two.
No, it's Falcon.
No, Falcon.
Rolls-Royce Falcon.
Yeah, 275. It was significantly better than anything else around.
But yeah, lots of power. The issue, there's two issues with it. There's always a couple of issues with the airplanes. I got a couple of pages of notes, and all I wrote on them were the gotchas, the things that are going to get you. And on the Bristol Fighter, the aileron control is very poor. And again, there's lots of adverse yaw because it's a very high aspect ratio wing. So there's a lot of damping and not much roll control. And it's a ground looper. It's got a fully castering tail skid almost. It doesn't caster all the way around, but it's got a castering tail skid, non-steerable. Narrow undercarriages, which is quite well forward. And so you have to land it into wind. And if you don't land it into wind, it ground loops. And I remember briefing a guy at Old Warden. I said, whatever you do, I said, there's the other issue is that it's got a manifold. I can't remember the name of it, a pressure manifold with 6 taps on it. And the fuel goes to the engine via air pressure. You've got a tank under the seat, and you've got a tank in the front of the fuselage. You've got air pressure that comes from a hand pump, from a Rotary propeller pump, and an engine-driven pump, and a blow-off valve. All of these air things go into a little box in the cockpit with 3 valves either side. And there's various emergency procedures if you get a loss of air pressure, because with so many valves and so many pipes, regularly get a failure of some sort. And I used to brief pilots that if you get an air pressure problem and you believe you know what's going on, land immediately, because you're just about to screw up. Because if you did nothing, the engine normally kept running even at a slightly lower RPM. But if you turn the wrong valve off, then the engine would quit. So I said 3 things you need to know really, and that's don't touch the air pressure manifold. Watch the roll control, and it's a ground looper. And I briefed one pilot and I said always land into wind. And there's a crosswind on the main runway, so people were coming in, flying down the crowd line, then turning right and flying away from the crowd to land the airplane. And he came in doing the old look at me on wonderful act, and decided to land parallel with the crowd, and gave them an absolutely classic demonstration of a ground loop as the wind caught him and he slowed down. But there you go. It's a nice airplane to fly.
I can agree with the aileron response on that Mark quarter scale model. Is non-existent, really.
Yeah, well, on your scale model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to fly it on rudder.
Yeah.
Yeah, aileron control was something that took a while to really get sorted out, didn't it?
Yeah. It was only really sorted when they started reducing the size of the wings too, because it's and high at low speed you don't get much lift off a wing, so you don't get much lift off the aileron, and there's a lot of damping from the wing area of a biplane, and you've got to overcome that damping if you want to make the airplane roll. So you've also got to overcome the natural stability.
Yeah.
So it's not until aircraft start flying a lot faster with a lot stiffer wings.
And of course, you've got a very flexible structure as well, haven't you?
Yeah, less wing area too. So.
Yeah. Good. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Is that us now? Can't see anyone else listening. Let me just check this raising hand part again. No, I think that's us. Well, thank you once again, Andy, and thank you everyone for joining. Just for reference, in no particular order, these are the countries that were online tonight. So Sweden, Brazil, Spain, UK obviously, Finland, Norway, Greece, Germany, Netherlands, Australia, New Zealand, USA and France. So 4 continents. So thank you very much for supporting it. We've now got the next few sort of sessions lined up. So right through to the end of July. The one in 2 weeks' time will be given by Martin Kinder, who was on earlier but has just dropped off. And it will be entitled From Paper to Burning Balsa. So basically taking a plan, plotting it, going through the sort of CAD side of things, and then he has a very simple laser cutter. And so we'll see cutting like wing ribs for, in his case, an indoor model. So that's the next one. And then 2 weeks following that, which is June the 24th, I think, we go over to the US, to Mr. Barbie in Ohio. Mike and I are going to speak this Sunday to decide what he wants to speak on, and we'll start putting that together as well. And then there's various other faces that I can see that I've already started speaking with as well for later on in the year. So yeah, just look out for the joining instructions. But just final sort of thanks to Roger again for hosting, and to Andy for delivering a brilliant presentation. Learned more this time as well. So round of applause for Andy, everyone. Thank you. There we go. Thank you.
Can I say something just before you go, Graham?
Yep, go for it.
What I'd like to do is recognise what Graham's done here. I think he's done an absolutely brilliant job organising this, pulling it together, getting everything sorted out. One of my remits as chairman of the Scale Tech Committee was to open up Scale and increase the participation. And I think in 7, 8, 9 years on the Scale Tech Committee, all I've managed to do is to get 4 or 5 people to enter light scale. Whereas in 6 months, Graham has got 40, 50 people together from all over the world. So I think he's done a fantastic job. So hands up to Graham.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well done, Graham. Yep.
Thank you. Okay, well, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Ricky Bould, I just have to do a personal message to him quickly. I'll send you the joining instructions for our meeting this evening for you, tomorrow morning for me. Okay?
You're gonna mention the anniversary this year, Graham?
Oh yes, that's one thing that we'll say. We'll go a little bit further ahead. So July the 22nd, Paul Antonisen there from Norway, that just spoke, it's actually the 50th anniversary of the first Scale World Championships. We would have been in Norway around that time. Well, certainly the UK team would have arrived on the 23rd, I think. So we're going to go and have a look back at 50 years of the World Championships in July the 22nd, including a visit to the World Championship site in Norway, where we are now going next year, Paul, from July the 15th? 17th?
To 24th.
So yeah, we'll see some nostalgic clips that night. And so thanks once again, and see you in 2 weeks' time.